144 degrees Fahrenheit. That was in June of 2018. The warmest temperature was 63.4 degrees at the Esperanza base on March 24th, 2015. It's a bit of a paradox that most of Antarctica is warming while a small portion of eastern Antarctica is actually cooling. And scientists from around the world travel to Antarctica to study the climate change issues as well as the environment. It's a remarkable environment to do scientific research. Antarctica has some of the most extreme weather on Earth. The weather patterns you can see moving here around the Southern Ocean are heavily influenced by the counterclockwise rotation of the Southern Ocean currents, while the weather patterns move in a clockwise rotation. The Southern Ocean collides with the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans in an area known as the Drake Passage. This is considered to be among the most dangerous waters on Earth. And you see the little hurricane-like swirling weather. You'll see just how rough those waters can be in a few of the additional slides. They say getting there is half the fun some of the time, and every journey in life we know starts with the first footstep. My journey to the bottom of the world was no exception. The expedition required months of planning, training, and logistics. So why would anyone want to go to Antarctica? Well, in 1823, Captain James Weddell went to Antarctica to hunt seals. He was followed by Sir Ernest Shackleton, who some of you may have heard of. He was among the first modern Antarctic explorers. And this is an advertisement that was put in the London Times to find a crew for his second expedition in 1914, within just days of the start of World War I. The name of the ship was Endurance, and they called it Endurance for a reason. The name comes from the Latin fortitudine vincimus, or through endurance we conquer. While it's orders of magnitude safer and easier to get to Antarctica today, there's still some measure of truth in this statement. And so, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my chance of fame in case of success here. Of course, Sir Ernest's ship didn't go his trip didn't go exactly as planned. You can see this photograph taken by the expedition's photographer at the time, where the Endurance became locked in ice. It was eventually crushed and sunk, setting off one of the greatest nautical stories ever told. If you have not read the book Endurance, I strongly encourage you to do so. Shackleton's men were forced into 3 lifeboats and set out for eventually a small pile of rocks known as Elephant Island. Widely considered to be one of the greatest feats of seamanship, Sir Ernest Shackleton and 5 of his men set out in a small boat about 22 feet in length and sailed over 800 miles to South George Island to get help. They eventually returned a couple of months later to rescue every single member of their ship. I thought it'd be fun to do a little Facebook post. Makes getting there seem very easy. And reality was, of course, otherwise. I flew from Boston down to Atlanta, from Atlanta to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and then from Buenos Aires down to a place called Ushuaia, which is the southernmost city in the world. Once we arrived in Ushuaia, I got settled for a few days, and then it was on to a research ship for about a 2.5-day passage across some of the worst seas in the world, and eventually arriving in the Antarctic Peninsula. I arrived in Ushuaia several days ahead of the ship's departure date to cover some travel logistics and to meet up with some of the scientists, researchers, and divers that would be joining me on the expedition. I had a chance to explore this part of the world, which I had never been to, and we hiked up into the glaciers you can see at the top of your screen. Those glaciers are receding dramatically. You can actually see the line, the tree line there, where the glaciers once extended down to. I also got a chance to do a little hiking in the Patagonia region along the Chilean border and then across onto the other side of it. And here we had a chance to dive in the Beagle Channel. It's the body of water you're looking at. You see the quay in front where the ships are docked. The second one is the ship that we ended up taking across. One thing that was very interesting, and you'll see it in some of the photographs we have, is that the underwater environment in Ushuaia and also in Antarctica was not that different than the underwater environment that we see off Cape Ann. In this case, in Ushuaia, the water temperature was about 46 degrees. And that was about 10 degrees warmer than the last training dive I did with my dive partner, Chris Miller, at Back Beach in Rockport before I left for home. So I was feeling warm and good about things when I jumped in the water there. This is the Ortelius. That was our ride to Antarctica. It's a 300-foot Polish-built vessel for the Russian Academy of Science. You'll note the ice-reinforced hull in the front. Those are those ugly ribs in the front. Ocean-wide expedition hosts naturalists and scientists, researchers, and other intrepid wanderers from around the world on expeditions to both the Arctic and the Antarctic. There were over a dozen countries represented on this particular trip. Our ship was named after the 16th century Dutch cartographer Ortelius. You may recognize his Theater of the World map. It was the first to imagine that the continents were once joined together. Ortelius's map was actually the basis for what we now call the tectonic plate theory. You can see how in this case, how they would fit together. Anyone who's been on a cruise is familiar with the old life jacket drill. They are mandatory. That's me in the background. If you were to fall off the ship, and you survived the fall, the massive waves and the gale force winds, the survival rate was less than 5 minutes. Turns out that the life jacket drill was a good idea after all. Over the course of the next 2.5 days, we had 35-foot seas, 65 knots of wind greeted us in the roaring 40s latitude. And this is commonly referred to down there as the Drake and Shake. This is a 300-foot ship that's getting knocked around pretty good. Because it was an expedition, they're a little looser on some of the rules, and we were allowed to go up into the bridge and observe what the crew was doing. It was really, the seamanship was just remarkable. Not long after this photograph was taken, the captain wisely decided to close the decks to the passengers and the crew because it was just getting too dangerous to be outside. And I mentioned the 35-foot seas. It was often difficult to know which way the waves were coming from. It seemed like they were hitting you from 3 different angles, and the wind patterns were essentially mini hurricanes. This led to quite a bit of a list in the ship. It's called a weather list. This is my friend Dan Orr, and you can see those handrails, which were all around the ship, came in rather handy with this 20-degree list. As did the barf bags. The rails were a convenient place to store them. I did not get seasick. Many of my shipmates did. We left Ushuaia for the Arctic Peninsula in Western Antarctica. Our destination was the Gerlach Strait and also the Lemaire Channel. 2.5 days, the closest landing in Antarctica is the Gerlach Strait. At this point, we're approximately 840 miles from the South Pole. After more than 2 days, this was one of the first photographs I took of Antarctica. It was truly spectacular to see, and just the fact that it was land and we weren't getting knocked around was also pretty comforting. I want to talk a little bit about icebergs now. 98% of Antarctica is covered in ice. These are massive ice sheets that are pushed into the sea from glaciers, becoming what are called ice shelves. When large chunks of ice calve from the ice shelves, due to the warming waters below, they become what we call icebergs. Icebergs are actually characterized by their size. The largest, more than 15 feet, are called icebergs. The smallest are called growlers, and everything else is actually called a bergy bit. Bergy bit. Climate change is having a profound change on Antarctica and the world. The shelf of the ice of the a shelf the size of Delaware broke off from the Larsen Ice Shelf, Larsen C, in 2017, and this trend has continued in the recent years. One of my fellow divers, Chris Heels from the UK, took this amazing photograph. We came to call this Antarctica Blue, and you can just see the truly extraordinary colors and the reflection of light in this photograph. You can also see the ridges and how the water, the iceberg is melting in a vertical plane. And I'll show you some down in the lower right here. It's melting in the horizontal plane as well because of the warming water underneath it. Scientists study icebergs for clues to the processes that causes the ice shelves to collapse and to predict the impacts of climate change. We use these military-grade zodiacs to explore the icebergs from a safe distance. This slide gives you some sense of the scale of this amazing place. The ice is constantly changing, and you'll note the vertical fissures and cracks in the ice. This photo was taken with a telephoto lens. Getting too close to these is extremely dangerous. In the course of the time we were down there, you'd hear loud, what sounded like explosions or cannons going off, and it was actually the sound of calving ice sheets. The Catabatic winds are winds that flow over the ice shelf throughout much of Antarctica. They can reach speeds of over 180 miles an hour. And in this case, you can see how the Catabatic winds have actually blown a hole through one of the ice shelves here. And you'll see the vertical crack below it. Icebergs are constantly melting from above and below. One of our divers, Mark Boudreau, captured this image. Note how the sea melts change the buoyancy of this remarkable iceberg. And remember, 90% of this iceberg remains underwater. This is one of my favorite photographs from Antarctica because it really captures a lot of what's happening there. In this case, you can see the ice is melting from the warming water and rising up. And then it's also melting in the vertical axis from the warming air temperature. And then you have the Catabatic winds blowing through over in this side. It's also a nice place to take a nap. That's about a 2,000-pound crab-eater seal sitting on a little bergy bit. In September 2017, I received a call from Faith Ortons, who was formerly with Diving Unlimited International. They're a manufacturer of high-end dry suits, and they asked me whether I'd be interested in joining this invite-only expedition. It turned out to be the mother of all hall passes for my wife and kids. I was going to be gone for a month, and it was going to be quite a challenge to get there. Faith now leads exotic trips with a company called Blue Green Expeditions. I was fortunate to dive with her last year, 2019, in a place called Hornby Island up in Vancouver. We were diving with some stellar sea lions up there, and that was truly a lot of fun. Our team and guides on the ships, this is on the helicopter pad of the ship, were from all over the world. We had divers from Norway, Sweden, Scotland, England, Canada, and the US, all places known for hardy cold water diving. The guy standing to the left, just outside of our circle of trust there, is Kerr. He's an Aussie, and he was our only true warm water diver on the trip. He was dumb enough, I think it was a bet, but he was dumb enough to go skinny dipping on a dare. And thus proving his mettle. So we welcomed him back into our cold water club. I'd say also that approximately 1/3 of our team were women, and they were among the best divers in our expedition team. Some of the stats about diving in cold water. It's a very dynamic cold environment and requires a dry suit, not a wetsuit. The dry suit, you wear heavy undergarments underneath it. Some divers dove with some underwater heat systems that you have in your suit as well. Those were unfortunately confiscated on the way back at the airport because of the batteries that they had in them. Due to the remoteness of the area, rescue really could not be possible here. There was no way to get back. There's no way to fly a plane in. So one of the requirements was to have what's called repatriation of remains insurance. If you had a spot of bother down there and they needed to get you back. We had multiple diving doctors on the expedition. We had an infirmary on the ship, but mistakes can have pretty critical outcomes in this environment. We used up over 26,000 cubic feet of air. The average water temperature was about 34 degrees. The coldest temperature we had was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Over almost 30 tons of gear was loaded on the boat. when we dive, we often talk about the visibility, and visibility here ranged from 15 feet to a maximum of 45 feet. To put that in perspective, that's not that different than what we have here in New England. Our diving was limited to a maximum depth of 66 feet for several reasons, the most significant being that we did not have a recompression chamber on the ship. So if there was any type of barotrauma or decompression sickness, the ship would not be able to treat that illness. So that was a safety call that was made by our safety officers and part of our dive plan. It's important to have the right gear for the trip. We use two regulators in what are called an H-valve formation. In this case, if you look at the top here, there's two different regulators that are hooked up there that convey air back to your mouthpiece. If one were to freeze up, you could isolate it and then turn on the other one and breathe off the second one. The equipment that we use is very highly specialized. We did not have any significant equipment failures on the trip. If you've never used a dry suit, one of the things that you're mindful of is that this hose actually connects to your suit. So you can put air into your suit, and then to get your suit out, you have a valve on your left arm. So you raise your left arm, that's the high point, and the air will drain out of your suit. Those growlers, which are curiously also the sound you make when you first hit the water, are a lot of fun to play in. We had a lot of fun just snorkeling around them. We also practiced some buoyancy control and checked our scuba kits for leaks before we got into any serious diving. This photo, as with several others, is courtesy of Becky Shad. She's an Emmy Award-winning underwater photographer and videographer, and you've likely seen some of her work on the Discovery Channel, Nat Geo, and some dive industry magazines. You can check out her website at Liquid Productions for some truly extraordinary underwater photographs. Here's Faith swimming around a bergy bit. So 90% of iceberg's volume is in mass is underwater, and that can be explained by Archimedes' principle of buoyancy. The buoyant force on an object is equal to the weight of the fluid displaced by that object. I'm at about 65 feet below the surface in this photo. So when you're diving on icebergs, you have to remember that they spin, they're melting, they can rotate or flip at any time. There is fresh water adjacent to the iceberg, which is less dense than seawater, which means it has less buoyancy. Salt water is more dense than fresh water, so it has increased buoyancy. Rapid changes in the buoyancy can cause barotrauma and pulmonary embolism. And this was something that was briefed and to us before we dove it, but to actually experience it was something that could really kind of rattle you when you first got there. You start sinking very rapidly when you get close to the iceberg. If you swim away, you start shooting up rather fast. Here's a little video of what it looks like diving on an iceberg. That's me. We have dry gloves, but there is skin exposed on your face when you're diving underwater. The underwater visibility here is a bit hazy. You can see that's what it looks like. And the iceberg itself is smooth, almost like a glass-like finish on it. We had to be very selective as to which icebergs we dove, and we had excellent guides who always put our safety at the forefront of everything that we were doing. It's always time to celebrate your first successful iceberg dive. Here I'm with Canadian diver Connie Foss, one of the truly remarkable divers out of Canada. So invertebrates are animals without backbones. They comprise about 95% of the animal species and arguably some humans. Sea anemones are actually predatory animals related to jellyfish and corals. They have tentacles with stinging cells called nematocytes, and they can be retracted into the body of the animal. These are very similar to what we see when we're diving here in New England waters. Sea anemones are benthic dwellers. They attach themselves to hard substrates, typically rocks and occasionally a shipwreck. And like most invertebrates, they are very slow growing due to the extreme environment. This is particularly true in places like Antarctica because the environment is so extreme that the growing season is much more attenuated than it is here. These anemones come in a variety of colors, and you can see the little sea urchin on the left there. Again, very similar to our green anemones that we have here in New England. This is a giant nematine or a ribbon worm. They're about 3 feet long. They're a carnivorous scavenger with the consistency of jello. They chew their way into dead animals on the ocean floor, typically seals, and they eat them from the inside out. My buddy Dan Orr picked this thing up, rolled it, and then threw it at me underwater. Sea stars like this one force their stomachs against their dead prey and excrete digestive fluids to dissolve a hole into their dinner, and then they eat the soft flesh inside. Very pretty, but not the best eating habits. There are several species of brittle stars and sea stars in the Antarctic waters. This is one of them, kind of an electric blue color, very cool looking. This is a basket star. When they break off their arms, their tentacles on the right side, you can see that as a means of a defense. A new arm is then regenerated. They are a member of the echinoderm family, and they have water-based vascular systems. If otherwise, they would bleed to death. This is called an Antarctic Sun Star, and this animal was about 3 feet across. It's truly a cool-looking starfish. Mollusks like this one were pretty rare to find down there. I think I saw fewer than half a dozen of them. Vertebrates are animals with vertebrae or backbones, and with few exceptions, we humans are vertebrates. This is called a salp. It's a barrel-shaped planktonic. They lack a spine or a skull, and they move through the water by pumping water through their gelatinous body. Although they look very similar to jellyfish, they're actually quite different. And biologists consider them to be members of the phylum Chordates. They're a group of vertebrates and invertebrate animals that at some point in their life cycle have at least a rudimentary spinal column. One of our extraordinary team members was Dr. Angel Yagnihara. She's a professor of biochemistry at the University of Hawaii, and as I learned, was the foremost authority in the world on box jellyfish, which have the most toxic venom of any animal on Earth. Dr. Yagnihara was one of many of the scientists that were on the trip that had given TED Talks, and who's just fascinating to listen to and learn about the work that they do. This is an Antarctic cod. It's actually not a cod at all. It's more closely related to the Patagonian toothfish. You would know that as the Chilean sea bass. And these fish are really remarkable in that they're able to survive by having antifreeze glycoproteins in their blood. Their heart beats about 1 time every 6 seconds. And cardiac researchers in cardiac medicine are interested in knowing how glycoproteins might be used in human cardiac procedures. A lot of science to be had down in Antarctica. Note the sugar kelp there is very similar to what we see in New England. Made me feel right at home. Nothing moves very fast in Antarctica. We saw some other cool stuff that were more akin to space aliens, so I made a special slide for them. I'd never seen anything like this before. This is actually a juvenile king crab. One of the major issues associated with climate change is ocean acidification due to the rising atmospheric CO2 levels. Ocean acidification is a very serious threat to marine ecosystems, and even very small changes, almost minute changes in pH can result in substantial mortality for these animals. Being a New England lobster diver, I had to try my hand at picking one of these things up. They are quite tasty. This gnarly looking giant isopod is something that I found when I was down there. They live on land and in the sea. They have rigid segmented exoskeletons, not unlike a lobster. Like some teenagers, they tend to live in a constant state of semi-hibernation. They're usually found much deeper, as much as 8,000 feet, and they're generally scavengers living in the benthic zone. Here's a little guy swimming around. Looks like something could be in a sci-fi movie. There are several species of seabirds in the Southern Ocean that are unique to that area. They're remarkably adapted to the harsh environment, and these are a few of my favorites. This first one is the Antarctic petrel at sea. As we got closer to the peninsula, we were greeted by petrels. They eat krill and fish and small squid. Like many seabirds, they have a salt gland above their nasal passage to desalinate their bodies due to the high amount of ocean water that they imbibe. This is the wandering albatross, or the southern albatross, sometimes known as the goonie bird. It has the longest wingspan of any bird, as much as 11 and a half feet. They can travel as much as 75,000 miles in a single year. They only land to breed and to feed. Some of you may be familiar with the ancient mariners that believed that the albatross was considered a sign of good luck, but killing one could curse the ship. In Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, a sailor kills an albatross with a crossbow, and the ship suffers many mishaps. The sailor is forced to wear the dead albatross around his neck as a symbol of guilt, hence the meaning of the psychological burden of having an albatross around one's neck. This is the Antarctic shag. It's very similar to our cormorant. They are the only Antarctic bird to keep a year-round nest. They can have a blue, red, or purple ring around their eye. What I thought was particularly remarkable about these birds is that they can dive to an average depth of 75 feet and have been recorded as deep as 250 feet, nearly twice the depth of a recreational scuba diver. This is the South Polar Skewa, and they are very aggressive birds. They will fly at the head of anything or any person that threatens their nests. Keeping clear of the skuas was good policy. They also happen to eat baby penguins. Speaking of which, penguins were really a highlight of our trip. We had researchers that did nothing but study penguins. We had a chance to go ashore and be able to view them. As part of our expedition, we were required to sign a biosecurity agreement. Essentially, we were required to decontaminate all of our equipment. That includes things like backpacks. You had to go through your backpack with a pair of tweezers and pull out any seeds or sticks. Anything that could contaminate the Antarctic environment was really a concern. Velcro definitely hangs on to that stuff. So this is Cooverville Island. We were briefed on nesting sites and landing areas and crevassed areas to avoid damaging any of the nests or risk falling into any of the deep trenches. Our objective here was to study the Gentoo penguins, whose populations are being researched for impacts from climate change. These are Gentoo penguins, a colony of several hundred birds here. They're about 20 inches to 35 inches tall. They weigh about 20 pounds. They've got rubbery feet, and they are very, very noisy. They're also very curious, and they will approach people or ignore you completely. They always seem to be going someplace and talking about it. The juveniles were coming into their adulthood, and they were shedding their baby feathers. Those are the funky little feathers that you see on the birds. Here's a penguin with a bad haircut. Gentoos love shiny things. The males will find shiny rocks and place them in their nests to attract females. This pair took an interest in a camera and a bag. Say that is not my camera. Little self-reflection is never a bad thing. Penguins poop a lot and take baths to wash the poop off their feathers so that they can stay warm. I think the two on the right are giving each other a thin five here. Certainly we're chatty. Penguins can't fly, at least not above water. This one seemed to love bath time more than many of the others. My fellow diver, Chris Heels, captured this picture. The rubbery little penguin feet are kind of fun to look at. After our dives, we went ashore to assist the penguin people with some of their research. It was a great chance to learn about these cool little birds. They're quite agile to get around on these rocks. You can see that we've got some divers out in the water that are taking video of penguins swimming. There's a little guy walking up to me. You can see Ortelius in the background of that shot. Here's an Adelaide penguin, well-fed, and a chinstrap penguin. You'll note that there are these pink areas underneath the penguin's wings, and you see this in multiple species of penguins. Parent penguins will take turns going to sea to feed for 3 to 5 days, ingesting massive amounts of krill and small fish. They come back and feed their babies with those, the chicks with those. To save those calories, they need to cool down quickly when they're out swimming as much as 20 miles an hour in the water. And so when they come up on land, the first thing they do is shake the water off them, then they hold their wings out. These capillaries underneath their wings actually act as radiators to cool down very quickly, and they can drop their body temperature quite quickly and save those calories for their chicks. Penguins typically enter water in groups to hunt for food. They're always on the lookout for leopard seals, which is the main predator for that species. Safety in numbers, I suppose. And while they can't fly on land, they are amazing swimmers and absolutely astonishing to watch underwater. Some of the earliest forms of whaling date back over to 3000 BC and flourished in the 18th and 19th centuries. Factory whaling ships emerged in the 20th century. In 1986, the International Whaling Commission banned commercial whaling because of the extreme depletions of the species. Only Iceland, Japan, and Norway support whaling today. We saw a variety of whales throughout our expedition. We saw humpbacks, the southern right whales, minke whales, and a few orcas. They were all extraordinary to see in the wild. We were fortunate to have a large population right off our own coast during the summer months here in New England. If any of you live in Cape Ann, you know what I'm talking about. It really is amazing to be able to go down and watch the whales just swimming a few hundred yards offshore. Here's a mother humpback and calf. Krill supplies food to virtually every living thing in Antarctica. They're about the size of your little finger and make up a large portion of the biomass down in the Southern Ocean. This is a large bait ball. Humpbacks use what's called a bubble net, feeding on krill. We saw this behavior several times, although this is, I'll tell you, this is a stock photograph. Drones are not allowed in Antarctica under the biosecurity agreements. You wouldn't want to lose your drone and have it contaminate the environment. Here, the whales would swim in a circle, blowing bubbles out of their blowholes. They'd do it around the bait ball, then they'd come up in the middle and ingest massive amounts of krill. That mouthful of krill is then pressed through these baleen plates, and the tongue is used to filter out the water. Late in the 19th century, the harpoon cannon replaced the traditional harpoon. These cannons quickly killed lots of whales. It made it somewhat more deadly for the whale, but somewhat safer for the whaler, which was a very dangerous profession in its own right. You can see here, that's an exploding tip. Once it enters into the whale, it would explode. This is it was developed by Sven Foyn, and we are in Foyn Harbor, which is where many of the whales were processed. Although there's very little whaling conducted in Antarctic waters today, with the exception of some quote-unquote scientific hunts by Japan, the legacy of whaling history is evident everywhere. There were several coves that we dove in that were littered with whale bones. This was once a cattle carrier. This whale factory ship was capable of producing 22,000 barrels. Those are 50-gallon barrels of whale oil. A party was celebrating the filling of the hold, and it ended badly when a lantern was kicked over, resulting in a massive fire in 1915 that sank the ship. Somewhat ironic that that would happen in these waters. This is the governor today, 107, 108 years later. The ship's captain tried to run the ship ashore and save some of the whale oil. The bow sticks out of the water, but the stern is in about 70 feet of water now. This is the hull of the ship, and what's really kind of interesting about this slide is that there is relatively little marine growth on the hull of this ship. It's due to the fact that it is such an extreme environment, and marine plants and animals do not grow very quickly. You can still see large swaths of hull available after more than 100 years. These sponges, these orange sponges, are decades old. This is the skull of a whale, and the whale bones were boiled down to extract the oil and then discarded over the side of the ship. It was eerie to see this many bones piled up in the bottom. These were water boats that were used to collect bergy bits, which you talked about, and that would replenish the ship's water supply. These were two of the ones that were abandoned not far from where the ship was. One of the, I think, other than the penguins, one of the more interesting things to see with the seals of Antarctica. They were first hunted in 1823 by Captain James Weddell, for whom the Weddell Sea is named. Like penguins, seals are very entertaining to watch, but their environment is considerably threatened due to climate change. We saw fur seals, crab-eater seals, and leopard seals. They're quite slow on land, but also excellent swimmers in the water. Here's a fur seal and a pup. This is a crab-eater seal, and you can see the long scars along the side of the seal and the flanks, and that was likely the result of a fight. Like teenagers, seals seem to spend a lot of time eating and sleeping. They're napping. Occasionally, they'll get in the water and play with you. We do see them around here in New England, off of the salvages off of Rockport, and we also saw a few off of Halfway Rock this summer when we were diving out there. Fat seal's a happy seal, and their blubber keeps them alive in this very cold environment. This is a leopard seal. Again, this is the apex predator, and they can grow up to 13 feet and weigh over 3,000 pounds. They can be quite aggressive in the water, and so we kept a keen eye out for them when we were diving. The only death known to have occurred from marine life in Antarctica was actually from a leopard seal. Grabbed a diver, a researcher that was down there, and she drowned as a result. They were able to actually recover her dive computer and get quite a bit of data off of it. And of course, they eat penguins. We did some hikes up glaciers and across some of the ice shelves during the expedition. Each time we left or returned the ship, we had to decontaminate our boots and our gear as required by the biosecurity agreements that we had signed. Our hikes provided insight on the changing climate from a different perspective. We left Cooverville Island for a place called Nico Harbor, and that was the first landfall we actually made in the continent of Antarctica. You'll see there are crevassed areas here in the landing area, and our objective was to hike to a tabular glacier. We had mountaineering guides that marked the unstable crevasses that can go hundreds of feet deep, and you'll see some red sticks, and those were to be avoided. Water-activated PFDs, life jackets or dry suits were required for all of the trips into shore. They also had survival kits with them in case we got stuck on land. This is an Argentinian research station called Base Brown. You can see the Ortelius in the background. Every trip ashore was an adventure, and cameras were always at the ready. Here you'll see the team of climbers going up to the top of the tabular glacier. The route was marked for us with the red poles. You can somewhat make them out here. One of our guides had actually summited Mount Everest, and he trains climbers to ascend Mount Vinson, which is the highest mountain on the continent. For some of our climbing folks, they want to climb the highest mountain on each continent, and so Mount Vinson would be your option here on Antarctica. These emergency huts are scattered throughout Antarctica where supplies can be stored and shelter provided. So every time we went ashore, we had a medical doctor with us with an impressive amount of equipment. We had AEDs and trauma kits and all kinds of emergency shelters and supplies, as well as food and fuel. And it's really the rapid changes in weather can create some life-threatening situations. So being prepared was an absolute must. We got a chance to go inside these things. They don't look particularly comfortable, but I imagine if you really needed it, it would seem like a little slice of heaven. The green hut is maintained by the UK, and the red hut is maintained by Antarctica. Dozens of countries together and separately have established these research stations in Antarctica to attempt to unravel the scientific mysteries of this amazing place. We left Antarctica by sailing through the Lemaire Channel, which is just an astonishingly beautiful place. We know that Antarctica is changing as a result of a warming planet. Leading scientists from around the world are working hard to study the impacts of climate change. While it's not likely that we can stop or even reverse climate change, we can mitigate what human impacts are having by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and adapting to these changes and retreating from vulnerable areas. So I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking with you quickly about some of the impacts of climate change and how it all pulls together. You cannot travel to Antarctica and not think about climate change. Many of the world's leading scientists, including researchers at NASA and NOAA here in the United States, as well as major universities, are all trying to study what is happening to our climate. Many of you know that the greenhouse effect and how it's trapping excessive levels of carbon dioxide or trapping levels heat inside our atmosphere, causing it to warm. If you look at the top, you'll see, or I'm sorry, in the bottom, you'll see that this is from 1953, and you'll note red is bad, and you'll see that as time goes on, the polar regions are warming. This is from NASA. This is what a warming planet looks like. NASA predicts that the Arctic will be ice-free. That's the Arctic in the north here, northern hemisphere, will be ice-free by 2050. Large portions of the Larsen Ice Shelf, that's in the northeast corner there, you see A, B, and C on this diagram. Large portions of the Larsen Ice Shelves have calved into the sea. Larsen A and B are already gone. Larsen C is next. These ice shelves are about the size of the state of Delaware, to give you some perspective. Carbon emissions and energy use is rising the fastest rate now since 2011. This is a NASA graphic, and it shows the rapid loss of the Antarctic ice mass in just the last 16 years. 1 gigaton equals 1 billion metric tons of ice. So to put that in perspective, if you were to look at the whole National Mall and covered it up with ice to a height of about 4 times as high as the Washington Monument, you'd have 1 gigaton of ice. Here, Antarctica is losing an average of 125 gigatons of ice every year. That's a lot of ice. So here's why, and I'll set this in motion. You see in the top left corner, that's the date. And this is the Arctic, and you'll see the Beaufort Gyre up there. And this is why it's now possible for travel between Alaska over to Europe, the Northern Passage. NASA currently projects that the sea level rise is expected to be as much as 4 feet by 2100. The warming atmosphere also warms the Earth's oceans, which act as a heat sink. Now, think about this, that when you heat something up, it expands, right? So the ocean temperatures are rising along with the atmosphere temperatures, is causing the ocean levels to rise, as well as having more water going into the oceans. And it's no surprise what's happening here. You can see in this graph, our global fossil carbon emission have skyrocketed, and along with it, our temperatures. I had this slide when I originally put this together, and I was able to do a little additional research. And the results are in as of January 17th. 2020 ranks as the, for a lot of reasons, a bad year, but it was the second hottest year on record for the planet, knocking 2019 into third place. 2016 still remains the hottest year on record. Might be interesting for you to note as well that the world's 7 warmest years have all occurred since 2014. Interesting issues here was that while I was in Antarctica, much of these storms were actually occurring back here at home. Locally, we can expect to have more heat waves, heavy downpours, sea level rise, and growing challenges to many aspects of our life. We know that climate change isn't causing hurricanes. The hurricanes have happened throughout the millennia, but they are making the storms more intense, and that intensity of the storms is causing dramatic impacts, particularly in our coastal areas. This graph shows what sea level looks like in our community. Many states and cities are beginning to incorporate municipal vulnerability assessments. Our community here in Manchester by the sea has done such an assessment, and it's been led from some of the researchers with Salem Sound Coast Watch, with whom I'm pleased to be affiliated. And it helps us understand how we plan for a future that is going to include higher sea levels. In our community here, it means impacts to some of our critical infrastructure, including our wastewater treatment plant, which has seen increase in maintenance costs and service issues related to rising sea levels. Increased CO2 has also contributed to ocean acidification. Those changes are causing disruptions in basic food sources like krill that are the basis of life in Antarctica and elsewhere. We're very familiar here in New England with lobster, and certainly something that I enjoy diving for and catching in my lobster traps. There's also an example here for what's happening because of global warming. We are experiencing what's called an epizootic shell disease, sometimes known as shell wasting disease. And you can see the lesions on this lobster. That's my son holding a lobster there. These lobsters are becoming more prone to predation and disease. They're much more vulnerable. They're also, it's impacting the fishery because these are not pretty lobsters to eat. Some marine biologists believe that the increasing ocean temperatures and changes in pH are causing these issues. We're seeing significant movement of the biomass within the last, these data are from the University of Maine, but in the last 20 years, the population of lobsters moved 120 miles to the north and east, essentially following the cold water. And so in the next, certainly within the next generation, we will not have lobsters here off the coast of Massachusetts. In fact, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. Let me say that again, the Gulf of Maine, our backyard, is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. So some of you may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, and it's made some astonishing findings. This represents the consensus of 196 countries that had adopted the Paris Climate Accord. I'm pleased to say that the United States this week has rejoined the Paris Accord, something that's very important to the future of humanity, and something that I'm glad our federal government has decided to reverse course on and get back to following our science. So what can we do? We can get involved, we can vote, we can support things like plans that reduce the use of petroleum and demand alternative energy options. There is work afoot in Massachusetts and other forward-leaning progressive states that are considering how to meet this challenge of climate change. And I think we can all do our part by supporting those policies, and then also supporting our local environmental groups like Salem Sound Coast Watch and others that are doing important work in this area. So that's it. I appreciate everybody's time today. There's a little bit of information about me, and I'd open it up to any questions if anybody has any. And Jenny, I think you're going to need to help me on that.
Hi, Michael. Sorry, could you repeat your question? I was fielding a phone call.
Oh, yes. No, if you can help me with my the questions, we can have a short period of time here for questions. If anybody's got any?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I don't see anything in the chat right now, but if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either type it into the chat, or in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the microphone. You can click there to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question that way.
I have a question. Did your suit ever leak? And it's a little bit. It leaked a little bit. They're called dry suits, but sometimes that's more of a aspirational than not. So yes, we wore very heavy polar tech underwear with some layers in between to make that happen. Yes, a question from Martin Bash. Is the name on the screen?
No.
Oh, okay.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. One is Peter says, "Great presentation, Michael. How long is the boat trip from port to the Antarctica?"
It was about 2.5 days over and about 2 days coming back. We had a little bit better weather coming back. It wasn't quite Drake Lake, but it certainly wasn't Drake and shake. The rough weather will really slow you down.
And then we have a question from Chris Miller. What is your next exotic location? Greenland?
I don't know, but I hope Chris Miller's with me when I go there. I think my next exotic location will be White Beach tomorrow at 10:30. And it's about as exotic as it's going to get. I understand that the nudibranchs are in, and although they're quite small, they're really beautiful to see underwater at this time of year.
And we have a question from Sandy. Is global warming impacting Antarctic and Arctic expeditions?
A great question. Very much so. There's in the Arctic, the calving icebergs are quite dangerous. And so you really need to be vigilant, even more so, that you don't get hurt when you're anywhere close to these things. It is also breaking up large chunks of ice. And so the equipment that's used to go down there has to be able to meet the challenges of that environment. COVID, although not related to climate change that I'm aware of, certainly has slowed our ability to go to the Arctic, which would be my next trip would be up to the Arctic. We'd leave out of Norway. Any other questions I can answer?
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, do you know what was the research they were doing on the Gentoo penguins?
It was looking at their nesting sites, collecting data on numbers. They also collected some samples of penguin poop, of which there was quite a bit. I think they also took some blood samples but I was more of an observer and somebody that would hold the clipboard for the penguin person.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yes, here.
Betsy, can you hear me?
Yeah, you should be.
No, because I got this in.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Again, a shout out to the Gloucester Lyceum and the Sawyer Free Library for hosting this talk. It's been my pleasure to be with you, and I wish you all a good day. And get out there and enjoy outside. Just because we have COVID going on doesn't mean we can't get outside and enjoy some fresh air. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.